Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our channel, where we explore the deepest and most terrifying mysteries of the world. Today, we have content that will give chills even to the bravest among you. We're diving into real stories and extraordinary events. These are accounts of sinister shadows, malevolent presences, and paranormal encounters that defy all logical explanations. Get ready to hear stories that will stir your mind and heart. From visions of spectral figures to terrifying premonitions, psychological escapes, and fears, these episodes will leave you questioning everything you think you know about life and death, and if we are truly alone, questioning your sanity. Waverly Hills Sanatorium was built in 1910, at the height of the tuberculosis epidemic that ravaged the United States. Located in Louisville, Kentucky, the sanatorium was designed to house patients suffering from this terrible disease, then known as the White Plague. At the time, tuberculosis was highly contagious and almost always fatal, with no cure or effective treatment. The sanatorium was built in an isolated area, surrounded by dense forests, to contain the spread of the disease. The original building had only 2 floors and a capacity for 40 to 50 patients. In 1926, due to the alarming increase in cases, a new, larger building was inaugurated, with a capacity for 400 patients. The new building had a dark and imposing design, with long, dark corridors, small, narrow windows, and an atmosphere that became even more oppressive over time. It all began with the discovery of a series of old documents hidden in a secret compartment in the basement of the sanatorium. These documents were found by a group of paranormal investigators who had been granted permission to explore the site. The papers, yellowed by time and covered in dust, contained records of experimental treatments, personal correspondence, and more intriguingly, a series of notes made by a doctor who worked at the sanatorium during the 1950s. These notes mentioned a secret project aimed at reaching beyond through unconventional methods. The content of the documents revealed that the sanatorium had conducted dark experiments, allegedly trying to interact with the other side in ways that surpassed the medical ethics of the time. Among the papers were records of forced hypnosis sessions, induction of deep trance states, and the use of techniques to communicate with the spirits of deceased patients. Brutal treatments. The treatments at Waverly Hills were rudimentary and often brutal. In the absence of effective medications, doctors experimented with painful and invasive procedures. Thoracoplasty, a surgery where several ribs were removed to collapse an infected lung and allow the other to expand, was one of the most common practices. Artificial pneumothorax, where air was inserted into the pleural cavity to collapse the lung, was also frequently used. Additionally, patients were subjected to heliotherapy sessions, where they were placed in outdoor beds, regardless of weather conditions, in the hope that sunlight would aid in healing. The death tunnel that no one wanted to pass through, one of the most macabre aspects of the sanatorium, was the death tunnel. This tunnel, a 150-meter-long sloping corridor, connected the sanatorium to the base of the hill where it was located. It was initially built to transport supplies, but was later used to discreetly transport the bodies of deceased patients away from the eyes of other patients. The tunnel became a symbol of the hopelessness and suffering that permeated Waverly Hills. Over the years, numerous reports of paranormal activity began to emerge. Patients and staff claimed to hear whispers, footsteps, and agonizing screams echoing through the corridors. Dark figures were seen wandering through rooms and hallways, disappearing into the shadows. Among the most famous ghosts are a nurse who allegedly hanged herself in room 502 and a boy named Timmy who liked to play with a basketball. The 5th-floor ward of Waverly Hills was a place of despair. It was there that the most critical patients were treated. The heavy atmosphere, filled with groans of pain and sighs of despair, made the environment even more suffocating. However, no one knew that this part of the sanatorium held the darkest and most disturbing secrets of all. In the heart of the 5th floor, there was a room that no one wanted to mention, room 502. This room had a macabre reputation. It was said that the doors creaked on their own, and ownerless shadows moved silently through the room. It was a place that patients and staff avoided because they felt an inexplicable coldness when passing by. This room was the epicenter of the most chilling stories of Waverly Hills. The story of the nurse who hanged herself in room 502 is one of the most disturbing. In 1928, a young nurse named Mary Lee was found hanging by a rope from a ceiling beam. Her death was ruled a suicide, but the rumors about what really happened never ceased. Some believed that Mary was pregnant by one of the doctors at the sanatorium, and upon discovering that he would not take responsibility, decided to take her own life. However, those who knew Mary said she was not the type to give up so easily. Her death left many questions unanswered. Why would she choose to hang herself in that specific room? And why did it seem that something more sinister was involved? After Mary's death, room 502 became an even more feared place. Nurses and doctors reported hearing whispers at night, soft voices that seemed to call their names. Some said they had seen the figure of a woman in a white nurse's dress wandering through the corridors, disappearing into the shadows. Patients complained of an unsettling presence, a feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. Among the ghosts that haunted Waverly Hills, the one of a boy named Timmy was the most intriguing. Timmy was a young patient who died of tuberculosis under mysterious circumstances. It was said that he loved to play with a basketball and that his spirit continued to wander through the corridors, looking for someone to play with. One night, a nurse named Linda, who worked the night shift, had a terrifying encounter. While making her rounds, she heard the sound of a basketball bouncing in the corridor. Curious and a little apprehensive, she followed the sound to a dimly lit corner. Turning the corner, she saw the indistinct figure of a boy with a ball in his hands. He looked at her with sad eyes, and the ball rolled toward her feet. Before she could react, the boy disappeared into the darkness. A basketball bouncing in the corridor. Curious and a little apprehensive, she followed the sound to a dimly lit corner. Turning the corner, she saw the indistinct figure of a boy holding a ball. He looked at her with sad eyes, and the ball rolled toward her feet. Before she could react, the boy disappeared into the darkness. That same night, Linda had another disturbing encounter. As she approached room 502, she felt a chill run down her spine. The door to the room was ajar, and she heard a soft whisper, calling her name. With a racing heart, she slowly pushed the door open and entered. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy and oppressive. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand touch her shoulder. Turning quickly, she saw no one, but the whisper continued, more insistent and desperate. Linda's experience was the last straw for many staff members. Reports of supernatural encounters became more frequent, and the legend of the hanged nurse and the boy Timmy became part of Waverly Hills' dark history. With each new visitor, the aura of mystery and terror of the sanatorium grew, leaving a trail of fear and unanswered questions. What really happened to Mary Lee? And why does Timmy's spirit continue to wander the corridors, always looking for someone to play with? These questions remain unanswered, but one thing is certain: Waverly Hills Sanatorium is a place where the past and present meet in a disturbing way, and where the dead never rest in peace. To this day, those who venture into the sanatorium report inexplicable encounters and terrifying visions. Waverly Hills remains one of the most haunted places in the world, a dark testament to human suffering and mysteries that should never be uncovered. Every shadow, every whisper, every step echoes as a reminder that some stories are eternal, and some secrets are better left buried. The haunted elevator in the center of the sanatorium. There was an elevator that, according to staff, had a life of its own. During the day, it seemed to operate normally, But when night fell and the sanatorium was enveloped in darkness and silence, the elevator began to behave in a frightening manner. Without warning or human intervention, it would ascend and descend on its own. The doors would open and close with an anguished creak, and the metallic echo would resonate through the empty corridors, as if invisible passengers were entering and exiting. Some brave souls who decided to investigate the elevator reported terrifying experiences. Upon entering the elevator, they felt an icy chill that penetrated their skin and made their blood freeze in their veins. It was as if an invisible force was watching them with penetrating, sinister eyes. Some even reported hearing soft whispers, a murmur that seemed to emanate from the walls of the elevator. One night, a curious doctor named Dr. Anderson decided to unravel the mystery of the elevator. He entered the elevator shortly after midnight, when the building was in spectral silence. The doors closed behind him, and the elevator began its slow and terrifying descent. Suddenly, Dr. Anderson felt a heavy, invisible hand on his shoulder. He turned around, but he was alone. A shiver ran down his spine, and the whispers grew louder, uttering words in a strange and incomprehensible language. The elevator abruptly stopped, and the doors opened with a metallic creak. Before him was the entrance to the morgue, a place even the bravest staff members avoided. The smell of decomposition and death invaded his nostrils, and he could make out the faint outlines of stretchers and body bags in the darkness. Suddenly, he heard a mournful groan that seemed to come from the depths of the morgue. A pale figure emerged from the shadows, eyes wide with pain and fear. Dr. Anderson felt panic rising within him. He ran back to the elevator, but the doors wouldn't close. The whispers grew louder, the groans more intense. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doors closed with a bang, and the elevator began its ascent. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, Dr. Anderson ran out, trembling and sweating. He swore never to enter that elevator again. From that night on, everyone refused to use the elevator after dark. Stories about the ghostly presence and terrifying trips to the morgue spread among the staff, and the elevator became a symbol of the unknown and terror. The question of who or what controlled the elevator remained unanswered, but the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes and the icy chill were constant for those who dared to approach the mystery. The haunted elevator of Waverly Hills remains an enigma, a sinister relic of a dark past. Each ride could be the last, and anyone who dares to enter it may find themselves under the watchful gaze of the inhabitants of the beyond. It is a place where the boundaries between life and death blur, and where the unknown always lurks, ready to devour the brave. Another story is the Morgue of Laments. The morgue at Waverly Hills is undoubtedly the most feared place in the sanatorium. Situated in the depths of the building, far from the sunlight and joy of the living, this location housed the bodies of deceased patients, awaiting transport through the sinister death tunnel. The air was heavy, laden with the penetrating smell of formaldehyde and death, a constant reminder of the fate that awaited many who entered the sanatorium. The gloomy air of the morgue. Upon entering the morgue, the first thing anyone noticed was the oppressive sense of despair. The white-tiled walls, once bright, were now stained by time and suffering. The lighting was dim, casting dancing shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whispers and groans that many claimed to hear, coming from the stretchers and mortuary drawers. The staff at the sanatorium rarely spoke of what happened in the morgue. Those who dared to share their experiences reported hearing soft, anguished voices, whispering incomprehensible words. Some reported feeling cold hands touching their shoulders or faces, as if the dead were trying to reach the living in a final plea for help. Several witnesses claimed to have seen spectral figures of patients, still in their hospital pajamas, wandering the corridors of the morgue. These apparitions were pale and translucent, with empty eyes that seemed to beg for redemption. One such story is of a patient known only as Thomas, whose figure was frequently seen sitting on one of the stretchers, gently rocking back and forth, murmuring. The ghost of Dr. Harvey. Another frightening account involves the ghost of Dr. Harvey, a doctor who worked at the sanatorium during the worst phase of the epidemic. It is said that he went mad due to the excessive number of deaths and ended up taking his own life in the morgue. His spirit, however, never found peace. Staff and visitors frequently report seeing a man in a blood-stained doctor's coat wandering the corridors, inspecting the bodies as if still searching for a cure for the disease that took so many lives. The Waverly Hills morgue continues to be a place of mystery and terror. Each whisper, each spectral figure, and each inexplicable chill feeds the legend that this is a place where the veil between life and death is extremely thin. Those who venture into the morgue leave with a sense of being watched, something that never really left. It is a place where echoes of the past continue to resonate, reminding everyone that some stories are eternal and some secrets are best left buried. This is the story of the Morgue of Laments, a place where terror and mystery walk hand in hand. A place where the dead do not rest in peace and the living fear what they may find in the shadows. If you dare to explore its dark corridors, remember, some doors should never be opened, and some secrets are best left forgotten. The caretaker who never returned. John, a caretaker who worked at the sanatorium in the 1950s, had an experience that marked him forever. One night, while doing his rounds, he decided to check the morgue, something he normally avoided at all costs. John was known for his courage, but that night, he felt an increasing unease as he approached the morgue. The darkness seemed thicker, and the silence deeper. Opening the heavy door to the morgue, a biting cold enveloped him, as if he had entered a tomb. The air was dense, saturated with the smell of formaldehyde and death. The sound of a deep lament echoed through the space, a sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. John's heart pounded, and he felt adrenaline coursing through his veins. Looking around, he saw the pale figure of a man lying on one of the stretchers, eyes open and vacant, staring at the ceiling. The man's skin was as white as marble, and his eyes seemed to reflect an infinite darkness. John tried to convince himself it was just a body, a tuberculosis victim, but something felt wrong. As John approached, the figure slowly rose, moving with a cadaveric stiffness. The man's hand reached out toward John, bony and cold fingers extended. Terrified, John backed away, but his feet seemed glued to the floor. The lament intensified, filling the air with palpable anguish. He felt a suffocating pressure on his chest, as if the morgue itself was trying to swallow him. With a scream, John managed to move, running for the door. The sound of heavy footsteps followed him, each step closer, until he finally exited the morgue and the doors slammed shut. But the horror did not end there. As he ran through the dark corridors, the lament continued to chase him, echoing off the walls, reverberating in his mind. He could feel a presence behind him, something no longer human. His steps became unsteady, and his vision began to blur. Finally, exhausted and terrified, John fainted, collapsing on the cold floor of the corridor. When other staff found him the next morning, John was in a deep state of shock. He couldn't speak, his eyes fixed on a distant point, as if still seeing something others could not. After that night, John was never the same. He left his job and isolated himself from the world, bearing the burden of a night that had changed him forever. The ghost of Emily. Waverly Hills was the scene of several suicides, both of patients and staff. The atmosphere of despair and isolation often pushed people to their limits. One of the most well-known cases is that of a young patient named Emily. Desperate over her terminal condition and tormented by visions of spirits, she jumped from the sanatorium's roof. After her death, several patients began to report the presence of a young woman wandering the rooftops, whispering and crying. They said that sometimes she approached the windows of patients' rooms, staring at them with sad, vacant eyes, as if seeking company in her lonely eternity. Waverly Hills was the scene of several suicides, both of patients and staff. The atmosphere of despair and isolation often pushed people to their limits. One of the most well-known cases is that of a young patient named Emily. Desperate over her terminal condition and tormented by visions of spirits, she jumped from the sanatorium's roof. After her death, several patients began to report the presence of a young woman wandering the rooftops, whispering and crying. They said that sometimes she approached the windows of patients' rooms, staring at them with sad, vacant eyes, as if seeking company in her lonely eternity. Emily's ghost became one of the most talked-about apparitions at Waverly Hills. Nurses and doctors often heard her mournful cries at night, and some even claimed to have seen her standing on the roof, her form barely visible against the night sky. The sightings of Emily added to the already thick atmosphere of fear and mystery that surrounded the sanatorium. The haunted hallways. The hallways of Waverly Hills are long and winding, with many corners that seem to lead into deeper darkness. Staff and visitors have reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread while walking through these corridors, especially at night. Cold spots are commonly felt, and some have described hearing footsteps behind them, only to turn around and find no one there. One particular hallway, known as the Hallway of Shadows, is infamous for the sightings of shadowy figures that seem to move along the walls. These figures are often seen out of the corner of one's eye and disappear when looked at directly. The origins of these shadows remain a mystery, with some speculating they are the restless spirits of former patients. The Nurses' Station. The Nurses' Station on the 4th floor is another hotspot for paranormal activity. The sound of disembodied voices is often heard here, with many claiming to hear the distinct sounds of medical equipment being used and the soft murmur of nurses talking to patients. Some have even reported seeing ghostly figures dressed in old-fashioned nurse uniforms going about their duties as if still caring for the sick. The operating room. The operating room, where countless surgeries were performed, many of which were experimental and brutal, is filled with a heavy atmosphere of anguish and suffering. The room is said to be one of the most haunted areas in the sanatorium. Visitors often feel a sense of unease and have reported hearing the faint sound of surgical instruments clinking and the distant moans of patients in pain. The Children's Ward. The Children's Ward, located on the upper floors, is where young patients were treated. Despite the intended purpose of providing care and hope, the ward has a dark reputation. The sounds of children laughing and playing are often heard, but these innocent sounds take on a sinister tone in the empty halls. Toys have been known to move on their own, and the ghost of a young boy, believed to be Timmy, is often seen carrying a ball and looking for someone to play with. The Chapel. The chapel, once a place of solace and prayer, now stands as a haunting reminder of the suffering that took place within its walls. Visitors have reported feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness upon entering the chapel. The faint sound of hymns and prayers can sometimes be heard, echoing as if carried by the wind from another time. Some have even seen the ghostly figure of a priest, standing at the altar, delivering a sermon to an invisible congregation. Conclusion. Waverly Hills Sanatorium is a place where the past and present are intertwined in a chilling dance of shadows and whispers. It is a place where the line between the living and the dead is blurred, and where the echoes of suffering and despair continue to reverberate through its halls. Each story, each sighting, adds to the legend of this haunted institution, making it one of the most notorious haunted places in the world. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the tales of Waverly Hills are a reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring impact of pain and suffering. Those who dare to explore its dark corridors often leave with a profound sense of unease, as if the eyes of the past are still watching, waiting, and never truly at rest. The Children's Room of Fear. On the upper floor of the sanatorium, there was a ward dedicated to children. Although it was meant to be a place of hope and treatment, it soon became a place of terror. The toys left for the children began to move on their own. Rubber balls bounced down the corridor, Toy cars moved without being touched. The sounds of children's laughter, which should have brought joy, became distorted and sinister. Nurses and visitors reported seeing the figure of a boy, Timmy, with a basketball, smiling unsettlingly before disappearing into the darkness. The nurses worked in panic, and there is a story that is still told today. Lisa, a newly hired nurse, decided to explore the children's room after hearing so many stories. Upon entering, she was greeted by a cold breeze and an oppressive silence. The toys were scattered across the floor, as if a group of children had suddenly run away. As she walked, she heard the soft sound of a ball bouncing. Suddenly, Timmy appeared at the door, holding his ball. He looked directly at Lisa, his eyes full of sadness. Without warning, he threw the ball to her, but before she could catch it, the ball passed through her hands and disappeared, just like Timmy. Lisa ran out, feeling the distorted laughter of children echoing in her ears. The stories of Waverly Hills are not just about ghosts, but about the thin line between reality and the occult. Each dark corridor, each abandoned room, and each whisper in the night are reminders that there are things we do not fully understand. Waverly Hills Sanatorium continues to be a place where the living and the dead coexist in a disturbing manner, a place where the past is never truly buried. This is the essence of Waverly Hills, a place where terror and mystery walk hand in hand. If you dare to explore its dark corridors, remember, some doors should never be opened, and some secrets are better left forgotten. The Enigma of Sarah. Sarah was a young patient who arrived at the sanatorium in 1935, a time when tuberculosis still claimed victims indiscriminately. From the beginning, something about her caught the attention of doctors and nurses. Her eyes had an unusual depth, and she seemed to carry an invisible weight, as if constantly on the edge of an unseen precipice. Sarah claimed to see the spirits of deceased patients. She described details of their lives and deaths with a precision that chilled even the most skeptical. On one occasion, she spoke of a patient named William, detailing how he had died of suffocation during a pneumothorax session. The medical records confirmed the story, but Sarah had never had access to those documents. Her accounts were so vivid and detailed that they began to spread fear and distrust among the sanatorium staff. Sarah's visions were not limited to patients. She spoke of a malevolent entity that, according to her, controlled the sanatorium. She described this entity as a dense, pulsating shadow with glowing eyes that exuded malice. The entity, according to Sarah, fed on the fear and despair of the patients, growing in power and influence with each death. During her episodes, Sarah would murmur in an unknown language, warning of the constant presence of this being. As months passed, Sarah's health worsened. Traditional treatments had no effect, and she began to spend long periods in a trance-like state. During these moments, she seemed to be in another world, her eyes fixed on something beyond human reach. She murmured incessantly, and some of the words were understandable. "He is here. There is no escape, the darkness is approaching." One night, in the middle of winter, a series of strange events occurred. Patients reported an oppressive feeling of fear, and screams echoed through the corridors. Lights flickered, doors slammed on their own, and shadows moved as if they had a will of their own. Sarah was in her trance state, and her words were more urgent, more desperate. The doctors and nurses were in panic, unable to control the situation. That same night, Sarah disappeared. Her room was empty, but the covers were disheveled, and the window was open, letting in the biting cold of the night. The search for Sarah was intense but fruitless. She simply vanished without a trace. However, the murmurs about the malevolent entity continued to haunt the staff, who swore they heard her voice in the corridors at night. After Sarah's disappearance, reports of paranormal activity increased. Staff claimed to see her figure wandering the corridors, her eyes now empty and filled with sadness. Some patients said she appeared in their rooms, warning them of imminent danger and whispering words of comfort before disappearing again into the darkness. Sarah's presence, or what was left of her, instilled a deep psychological panic in everyone who worked at the sanatorium. Every sound, every shadow, seemed to carry the promise of a terrible revelation. The corridors became places of constant fear, where no one wanted to walk alone. The feeling of being watched, of being at the mercy of forces beyond human understanding, became an inseparable part of life at Waverly Hills. What really happened to Sarah that night? And who or what was the entity she feared so much? These questions remain unanswered, shrouded in a veil of mystery and terror. Waverly Hills Sanatorium is a place where the past and present meet in a disturbing way, where the dead never rest in peace, and where fear becomes a tangible presence. The enigma of Sarah is a grim reminder that some stories are eternal. The sanatorium, with its dark corridors and oppressive atmosphere, continues to be a place where the living and the dead coexist in an unsettling manner. If you venture through these corridors, remember, some doors should never be opened, and some secrets are best left forgotten.
The Night of Shadow.
The Night of Shadows is recorded as a terrifying night documented in the sanatorium's records. On a cold winter night, a series of strange events occurred. Patients reported an oppressive sense of fear, and screams echoed through the corridors. Lights flickered, doors slammed, and shadows moved on their own. Sarah, in a state of delirium, began speaking in an unknown language, warning of something terrible approaching. That same night, several patients mysteriously died, and the survivors claimed to have seen a dark figure roaming the sanatorium. The places with the highest peaks of haunting in the sanatorium were locations that even the staff avoided. The fifth-floor ward of Waverly Hills was a place of despair. It was there that the most critical patients were treated. The heavy atmosphere, filled with groans of pain and sighs of despair, made the environment even more suffocating. However, no one knew that this part of the sanatorium held the darkest and most disturbing secrets of all. Room 502. In the heart of the fifth floor, there was a room that no one wanted to mention, Room 502. This room had a macabre reputation. It was said that the doors creaked on their own, and ownerless shadows moved silently through the room. It was a place that patients and staff avoided because they felt an inexplicable coldness when passing by. This room was the epicenter of the most chilling stories of Waverly Hills. The story of the nurse who hanged herself in Room 502. The story of the nurse who hanged herself in Room 502 is one of the most disturbing. In 1928, a young nurse named Mary Lee was found hanging by a rope from a ceiling beam. Her death was ruled a suicide, but the rumors about what really happened never ceased. Some believed that Mary was pregnant by one of the doctors at the sanatorium, and upon discovering that he would not take responsibility, decided to take her own life. However, those who knew Mary said she was not the type to give up so easily. Her death left many questions unanswered. Why would she choose to hang herself in that specific room? And why did it seem that something more sinister was involved? After Mary's death, Room 502 became an even more feared place. Nurses and doctors reported hearing whispers at night, soft voices that seemed to call their names. Some said they had seen the figure of a woman in a white nurse's dress wandering through the corridors, disappearing into the shadows. Patients complained of an unsettling presence, a feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. The ghost of Timmy. Among the ghosts that haunted Waverly Hills, the one of a boy named Timmy was the most intriguing. Timmy was a young patient who died of tuberculosis under mysterious circumstances. It was said that he loved to play with a basketball and that his spirit continued to wander through the corridors, looking for someone to play with. The encounter with the unknown. One night, a nurse named Linda, who worked the night shift, had a terrifying encounter. While making her rounds, she heard the sound of a basketball bouncing in the corridor. Curious and a little apprehensive, she followed the sound to a dimly lit corner. Turning the corner, she saw the indistinct figure of a boy with a ball in his hands. He looked at her with sad eyes, and the ball rolled toward her feet. Before she could react, the boy disappeared into the darkness. That same night, Linda had another disturbing encounter. As she approached room 502, she felt a chill run down her spine. The door to the room was ajar, and she heard a soft whisper calling her name. With a racing heart, she slowly pushed the door open and entered. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy and oppressive. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand touch her shoulder. Turning quickly, she saw no one, but the whisper continued, more insistent and desperate. Linda's experience was the last straw for many staff members. Reports of supernatural encounters became more frequent, and the legend of the hanged nurse and the boy Timmy became part of Waverly Hills' dark history. With each new visitor, the aura of mystery and terror of the sanatorium grew, leaving a trail of fear and unanswered questions. What really happened to Mary Lee? And why does Timmy's spirit continue to wander the corridors, always looking for someone to play with? These questions remain unanswered, but one thing is certain: Waverly Hills Sanatorium is a place where the past and present meet in a disturbing way, and where the dead never rest in peace. The Night of the Heartless Doctor. The Eldridge Sanatorium had a grim reputation, marked by stories of cruel treatments and patients who got lost in the labyrinth of cold, insensitive corridors. Dr. Maikon, the chief physician, was known for his clinical coldness and for treating patients with a detachment bordering on cruelty. He saw patients only as numbers and cases to be solved, with no room for empathy or compassion. But behind his facade of hardness was a secret that gnawed at his soul. Dr. Maikon carried an immense burden, one that could not be alleviated by the most sophisticated medical techniques or the comfort of his position. His daughter, Clara, had tragically died in a car accident 5 years earlier, an accident caused by his recklessness while driving drunk. The loss of Clara, along with his wife Laura, who was in the car with her, had transformed Dr. Maikon into a bitter man consumed by guilt. On a particularly dark night, Dr. Maikon, as was his custom, retired to his dark room after a long day of work. The sanatorium was enveloped in an oppressive silence, with only the faint light from the bathroom partially illuminating the environment. He lay down in his bed, hoping to find fleeting relief in the solitude of the night. However, something was different. A sudden and penetrating cold took over the room, and Dr. Maikon could not ignore the uncomfortable feeling that he was not alone. Trying to dismiss the discomfort, he curled up under the blankets and closed his eyes, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. But as he drifted off to sleep, the night turned into a whirlwind of grotesque nightmares and disturbing visions. He saw distorted faces, desperate cries, and a dark presence that seemed always to be lurking. When morning came, Dr. Maikon awoke abruptly. A silent scream froze in his throat when he saw a shadow slowly rising from his bed, as if someone were getting up. His eyes fixed on the indistinct shape, but there was no one there. A deep chill settled in his chest, and he got up quickly, cold sweat running down his forehead. His roommate, Dr. Allen, entered the room to call Dr. Maikon for an emergency. Seeing the pale and terrified expression on Maikon's face, Dr. Allen made a nervous joke. "It looks like you had an interesting night, huh? I didn't want to bother you. That blonde woman who slept with you must have been good company." Allen's words hit Maikon like a direct blow. He froze, his face losing all color. The description of the blonde woman was exactly his wife, Laura, who had died in the same accident as Clara. Maikon looked at his own arm and saw, horrified, red and deep hand marks, as if someone had tried to grab him.
Docteur.
Allen realized the gravity of the situation and approached to examine the mark. "And what happened to you? This type of mark is not normal." Maikon could barely respond, his voice trembling. He told Alan about the nightmare, the shadow, and the cold. Alan, with a serious look, suggested that perhaps the visions and the feeling of presence were manifestations of deep, unresolved grief and guilt, mixed with the psychological effects of years of stress. From that day on, the atmosphere around Dr. Micon changed. The sanatorium seemed to watch every step he took, and he felt a constant invisible weight, as if Clara and Laura were always lurking, waiting for a form of punishment or redemption. The mystery of his experience was never fully resolved, but the mark on his arm and the biting cold that accompanied him served as constant reminders of the price he had paid for his recklessness and lack of humanity. The nights at Eldridge Sanatorium continued to be a scene of untold stories, where the shadows of the past intertwined with the present, and the spirit of a lost family continued to haunt the place, seeking answers and eternal peace. The days passed, and what happened? Waverly Hills closed its doors in 1961 with the advent of effective antibiotics against tuberculosis. However, the legacy of pain, suffering, and death remained. The building, now in ruins, became one of the most haunted places in the world. Visitors and paranormal investigators continue to report frightening and inexplicable encounters. The story of Sarah and the other tormented spirits continues to haunt those who dare to explore the dark and abandoned corridors of Waverly Hills. The true nature of the evil that haunts Waverly Hills remains a mystery. It is a place where the line between the world of the living and the dead is thin, and where the echoes of a dark past still reverberate. Those who venture into the sanatorium often leave with a feeling of unease, as if something is watching, waiting, and never really leaving. The mystery persists. To this day, those who venture into the sanatorium report inexplicable encounters and terrifying visions. Waverly Hills remains one of the most haunted places in the world, a dark testament to human suffering and mysteries that should never be uncovered. Every shadow, every whisper, every step echoes as a reminder that some stories are eternal, and some secrets are better left buried. Thank you for joining us on this journey. May love and faith always guide your steps, even in the darkest moments.